My own background brings me naturally here. I 4 years at St. Ignatius High School in San Francisco, 2 years at the University of San Francisco, learned Latin, an incredibly useful thing if you're going to be a botanist, 4 years of Latin, 2 years of classical Greek, Andra Moyanipa Musa Palutropan, and a very, very fine education. I went on then to a lot of other things which have been alluded to. As has been said, since 1990, I've been a life member. All the members are life members of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, which is a non-denominational body of 80 people that advises the Pope on matters of science and technology. We don't look at the moral relationships of what we're talking about. We look at the science and technology and try to give the clearest possible rendition of the various fields that are worked on or attended to. The Catholic Church is the only church that has a body like the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and that's probably why the Catholic Church has not had any trouble with scientific concepts like evolution or like GMO crops or like climate change. It is a very big advantage, especially in a country where it's sad to reflect that some 40% of the people here do not accept evolution as an explanation of life on Earth, and that is just patently ridiculous. You know, there's no evidence at all for the way they look at it, but there's no scientific grounding there. But the church, starting in the 1920s, has really gotten out of that trap, which we ought to be very glad about. I've also had a close connection with St. Louis University. I gave a graduation speech for the university in 1981 in the arena, which was kind of exciting. It was the first time I'd addressed 18,000 people. The garden has been closely associated with St. Louis University since about 1965 and has turned out many joint graduates and continues to be so at present. And that's a very good relationship and one I know has been useful to the garden and certainly useful to St. Louis University, where I was an adjunct professor during the time I was working at the garden. Now, I want to start by pointing out to you or telling you, if you don't know it, that a few hours ago at the Vatican, at St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Francis began a synod on the Amazon, which involves 185 bishops, priests, and brothers, along with 80 non-religious advisors who don't vote in the synod, but who take place fully in the discussions. And among those 80, it's notable that there are 33 women, which is a subject that we'll come back to later. The Synod was started, the original idea of the Synod began about 18 months ago. The reason was because Catholicism is weakening in those countries, basically where evangelical Christianity is growing. And people naturally wanted to think about why, and they wanted to think about what the church could be to be more relevant and more effective there. The Pope Francis has referred to this synod as the child of the encyclical, as a child of the encyclical, and in his mind, it's addressing the tremendous environmental changes that are affecting the Amazon and conditions of life in the Amazon. They interviewed over 20,000 people living in the Amazon in preparing for this synod and came up with various things about the church and what it might do. And they came up with things like older people who were married might be received as priests, that the role of women might be enhanced and that might be enhanced in the region, and that people needed more effective ways to be able to speak out about the environment from the church. And of course, that immediately brought a roaring kickback from the conservative elements in the church, as these things always do. And The Pope responded by saying, and I think this is pertinent to the whole story for today, Jesus did not come to bring a gentle evening breeze, but to light a fire on the earth. Adding that in their ordination, Catholic bishops receive a gift of ministry that is like a fire that they are to share with others. He said, "A fire does not burn by itself. It has to be fed or else it dies. It turns into ashes. If everything continues as it was, if we spend our days content that this is the way things have always been done, then the gift vanishes, smothered by the ashes of fear and concern for defending the status quo." That's a very powerful and very interesting statement, well worth thinking about. Now, just a few weeks ago, the Pope was visiting, and you may have read this in the papers, the African countries of Mozambique and Madagascar. And Africa is the area of the world where the Catholic Church is growing most rapidly. You might know it's also the area of the world where the population is growing most rapidly. In those countries, the Pope, in one part, sitting next to the president of Madagascar, spoke out forcefully on the destruction of forests and its effect on biodiversity, which we'll get back to in a minute, and ultimately on people. He spoke out very strongly about the matter of the foreign exploitation of Africa's resources, which leaves many of those countries needy and starving at a time when their populations are more than doubling in the next 30 years. Without the attainment of some kind of social justice and a lessening of greed by the richer countries of the world, exporting everything they can get their hands on from the poorer countries of the world, there never will be stability or sustainability globally. Now, the encyclical that we're addressing, Laudato Si', was released on June 18th, 2015, so a little over 4 years ago, and he titled it in a way to remind us of Francis of Assisi's Canticle of the Sun from 800 years earlier, 1225, and he said in doing so to help us acknowledge the appeal, immensity, and urgency of the challenge that we face. The encyclical is intended to provide strength, was intended in the immediate future, the next few months, to provide strength to the deliberations of the nations of the world at Paris 4 months later to try to come to agreements that they could do jointly to help alleviate the world climate change crisis. And it did have some effect on the outcome of those deliberations, although the actual actions taken after the Paris summit have been much more limited than any thoughtful person would really want. Now, as the Pope said, and this is a very interesting point, and I certainly urge all of you to read the encyclical, which is not very long, and it's a tremendously powerful document. He said, Laudato Si' is not a green encyclical. It's a social encyclical based on green reality. And as you'll see, the Church has long been aware of social reality, and social reality brings you face to face with environmental reality and makes you want to safeguard the earth. So how did we get to this point in the Earth's history? Well, let me outline briefly the context. Life began on Earth about 4 billion years ago, but didn't come onto land until about 400 million years ago, already 90% of the ways through the history of life on Earth. By that time, the processes of life that were taking place in the oceans and in the waters of the Earth, where they were protected from ultraviolet radiation, had changed the atmosphere of the Earth to the point where animals and plants could come up on the land without being destroyed by the radiation coming from the sun. Dinosaurs and mammals appear about 200 million years ago at about the same time. And of course, dinosaurs, it's always fun to note, gave rise eventually to birds. The birds we have today are descendants of the dinosaurs, and the mammals, of course, have gone along to now. The first hominids, the first animals that looked like us, appeared in Africa 6 to 8 million years ago. This is in a 4 billion year history of life on Earth. And our species, Homo sapiens, in the fossil record appears about 300,000 years ago in Africa and shows up in Eurasia about 60,000 years ago. There were other kinds of people that were already present in Eurasia, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other things that you've read about, but our species shows up about 60,000 years ago. What does that mean with regard to creation? It has to mean that if we take the story of the Bible about the creation of people literally, as I'm sure most of us do, it means that at some point human beings acquired souls and became the kind of sentient beings that we are now. And now, agriculture didn't begin until about 11,000 years ago, which might really surprise you in this long history. And at the time agriculture began, there were about 1 million people on Earth, about a third the population of St. Louis, 1 million people on the entire Earth, and about 100,000 people in Europe, only about 100,000 people. In other words, about the number that could fit into a large football stadium were the entire population of Europe 400 generations ago. So there's been very fast growth. In Genesis, we read about the differentiation of people into groups with different languages. For example, the Lord, seeing the Tower of Babel, according to Genesis, decided that people should never be allowed to get together again on big, nasty projects like that, and gave them all different languages and sent them on their way. Well, that might have been a good idea then, but it's not a good idea now, that's for sure. By the time of Christ, there were 200 million people on Earth, 60 million, half of which were slaves in the Roman Empire. Population grew steadily to about 500 million people, which is about the current population of Europe in 1500 AD, which is about when we can think of the Renaissance beginning. About 500 million people, to 1 billion in Napoleonic times for the first part, and then 2 billion in the 1920s and so forth, rapidly increasing with the impetus of the Industrial Revolution, up to the 7.7 billion people that we have today. The 7.7 billion of us are growing at about 280,000 people a day towards about 10 billion at the turn of the century, 30 years from now. During all this growth, people have tended to forget Matthew 40, the king shall answer and say unto them, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of my brethren, you have done it up to me. You've done it unto me. We have to ask ourselves, and this is a theme that I'll emphasize more as I go along, how many of us really care about starving people in Africa? What we're doing basically is cutting foreign assistance, cutting back on help there. When they have wars there, we seem to let them fester. And then, of course, closer to home, we can say, how deeply do we really care about the poor people who live in North St. Louis and the poorer parts of our own region, as measured by what we actually do about it as opposed to what we say about it? Sometimes people say, oh, well, you're preaching to the choir. And I say, of course people preach to the choir. The reason is that the choir is all too ready to sit there and say, oh, those poor people, and not to get up and do anything about it or get behind any kind of relief for those poor people. The global population has tripled since I was born in 1936. There are more than 3 people now for every one that was around then. The 8 wealthiest people in the world, 6 of whom live in the United States, possess as much wealth as the 3.6 billion poorest people in the world. 8 people possess as much money as 3.6 billion people. There are about 800 million people starving, going to bed hungry every night. and the world is not a very secure place. What I would suggest you take a look at, in addition to certainly to the encyclical Laudato Si, is the Global Footprint Network, which is something you can find on your computer. Global Footprint Network, an organization housed in Oakland, California, which calculates the pressure that we put on the earth and how it differs from country to country. One of the things that it estimates is how much of the world's total sustainable natural productivity do we consume. In 1970, when there are about half as many people as there are now, it was about 70%. Now it's estimated at about 175%, which is far beyond what the earth can support sustainably. Much of that damage comes from burning fossil fuels. The Pope Francis, has expressed deep concern with these findings, which indicate that resources are being consumed much faster than to be replenished. He considers the relationship, the environmental issue that shocks him the most. We have what Global Footprint Network calls Earth Overshoot Day, which is when we've consumed all the sustainable productivity of the world in a given year. And this year it was on about August 1st, and beyond that we were using up resources that might otherwise survive into the future. Now, we sort of idly think that everybody in the world is coming up to the standard of living that we enjoy in the United States and Western Europe, and if they're not there, it's sort of a matter of they haven't got themselves organized and all. That's basically because of a faulty economic theory to which we adhere, which assumes that as labor is increased, if labor is needed, so natural productivity will be increased if natural productivity is needed. Now, of course, nobody really believes that. It's an impossibility. But on the other hand, we act as if it's true. We act as if everybody can simply improve their lives and get onto a far better standard of living. In fact, a number of the poorer nations of the world are falling into what my colleagues and all have called an environmental poverty trap, which is one in which they've essentially used all of their sustainable productivity. Their average annual income is falling, and foreign countries are basically scooping up what they can and sending it elsewhere. When we did that, when Britain did that, when Spain did that, when the Netherlands did that, when Portugal did that, France in the past, there was a lot more to be consumed and scooped up. But now, if we're operating on 175% of the total capacity of the earth, there's not very much to be scooped up without seriously damaging the ones from whom we're scooping. Climate change, which is one of the major problems we face now, and one of the reasons that the Pope issued the encyclical that we're talking about, was first predicted by the Nobel Prize winner, Sweden, Svante Arrhenius, in the 1890s, in other words, 130 years ago. And he pointed out, and this is undeniably so, that as the atmosphere got thicker and thicker with the gases that we were putting into it, that the sun's radiation hitting the surface of the earth would be unable to escape, would be caught under the atmosphere, and as a result, the climate would become warmer and warmer. And one easy empirical way that you can look at that is to say that those planets that have a thick atmosphere are much hotter than those planets that have a thin or no atmosphere. It's a matter of trapping the heat as the atmosphere becomes increasingly opaque. For people who'd followed that, it was no surprise that we really began to notice the effects about 50 years ago. And for that reason, we established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Ipcc, which was conceived during the Reagan administration and backed up during the Bush administration with strong support from all the countries of the world. I should explain to you that the Ipcc, which issues periodic reports, it has about 6,000 scientists nominated to it. About 2,000 of them work on individual panels dealing with different parts of climate change. Each one of those panels reviews all of the available information that's accumulated since the last report as carefully as it can. And as scientists do, they all fight with one another to try to establish what's right and deny hypotheses, make hypotheses, and gradually get to a conclusion in that particular area. Then all those conclusions from those 2,000 people reviewing all the literature are brought together, and as they're brought together, they're read and approved by all the nations that are signatory to the Ipcc, 170 of them. In addition to that, every academic body in the world, every academy of sciences in the world, every national academy, every group of academies or world body, including the Pontifical Academy, has concluded that the Earth is warming rapidly. It's warmer than it's been for millions of years, and human beings are playing the major role in warming it. Now, think about, with that kind of background, what it means for somebody to get up and say, it's not really warming, it's just hot sometimes and cold other times, and it's on a cycle. Well, basically, they're either incredibly stupid or more likely they're lying, and they're lying because they want to protect short-term economic gain from established industries, which is about as immoral and about as harmful to the future of your children and grandchildren and my children and grandchildren as you could possibly get. One of the things you could do as individuals is understand the truth in this, understand scientific agreement, understand that even if the one or two people who are yakking about some counter theory are right, 99.9% of the scientists and people who know about it and who study it are in complete agreement on this. And if that's true, then say to yourself, what if 99.9% of the scientists said that a meteor was going to hit my house by Christmas, and there was still 0.1% saying, no, that's wrong, I think it's wrong. Would you live there happily in your house through Christmas, waiting to see if some random theory were true? One of the things you can do is get rid of those politicians. They're incredibly evil. They're incredibly immoral, and they're incredibly damaging your future and the future of everyone who comes after them, and there's no two ways about it. Inform yourself and act on it. Now, as the climate heats, the disease will spread, agriculture will be disturbed. We had a symposium here recently on Midwestern agriculture. The climate of the Midwest in 20 to 30 years will be the climate of northern Georgia now. The Arctic is melting, ships are sailing around, people are greedily scooping in there to try to get all the goods and minerals and things that are there in the Arctic, saying, oh, this gives us a great opportunity, and that's just wrong. On the one hand, they're trying to benefit from it, on the other, profit from it. On the other hand, they're trying to say that it doesn't exist. Biodiversity. As I pointed out a minute ago, we evolved from animals that came onto land about 400 million years ago in an atmosphere with soils, with water, and with all other environmental factors conditioned by the millions of kinds of organisms that live on the earth at the present time. If you think about it, we can live here only because of the conditions that they create as a living system, as an ecosystem. That's why Pope Francis is so deeply involved in this. It's because we can't get along without them. From plants, human beings get all of our food, all of it, directly or indirectly. Building materials. More than half of all the medicines used in the world are from natural sources. We can go on, and at an ecosystem level, we can point out that they control the atmosphere, pollution, the water, and everything else that makes our life here possible. When we knock out individual members of those ecosystems, we never know when we'll knock out so many that the ecosystems will cease to function. For example, there's substantial doubt that the Amazon forest will continue to function given a degree or two more of increase in temperature. And the Amazon forest controls the fertility, the soils, the climate of a vast area on which the livelihood of tens of millions of people depend, and which the Synod that started this morning in Rome will address over the next 3 weeks. A little bit about how the church has responded to all of this. Francis of Assisi, who lived from 1181 to 1226, which is very interesting because he died at 45 years old. And what is interesting about it, I always think, is 200,000 people were in monasteries and related bodies by the time he died, after having been converted at the age of 22 or so. About 200,000 people were actually living in monasteries or similar institutions, practicing the moral principles that he'd found important. That's why I never accept it when somebody says people can't make a difference. He certainly made a difference. Gandhi certainly made a difference. Abraham Lincoln certainly made a difference. Of course people can make a difference, but if they're going to make a difference, they need our support and understanding and our care and our personal preoccupation with and concern about what's going on. And if they have that, then many leaders can make a difference. If we don't care, if we don't bear down on the situation, if we sit there completely indulging ourselves for our daily lives and getting on with the business that we do every day, naturally things are going to continue to change for the worse. There's no other way about it. But to say we can't make a difference is nuts. As environmental problems grew and as climate change became more obvious, people became concerned. After a period when the United States controlled 55% of the world economy in the 1950s after World War II, and we all thought, oh, this is great, and apparently that's the fabulous world to which we're going to return when we make America great again. We're going to control 55% of the world's economy. And if you believe that, I have a bridge I'd like to sell you. It'll never happen again. After that gave way to a harsh look at reality in the 1960s, people really began to worry about the environment because they could see that growing numbers and growing levels of consumption were doing very bad things to it. Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970, brought out 20 million people in the United States. 20 million people came out of their houses on Earth Day. In 1970, that was 1 out of every 10 people in the United States. It's naturally that President Nixon followed and Congress followed with the adoption of a great deal of environmental legislation because it was so clear that people wanted it, being convinced of what they saw around them. Now, around them is kind of the key to that, because Earth Day was not an international movement, it was a national movement. It was, how do we stop our rivers from burning, our cities from being polluted, and all the rest. Internationalism and a sense of the fact that we all needed to cooperate together if we wanted the world to be sustainable developed through the 60s and reached its kickoff, we might say, at the United Nations Stockholm Conference on the Environment in June 1972, which turned out to be, it started out to be a conference on polluting the Baltic, but it ended up being a conference on the fact that all the countries in the world were involved in the future of the world, and we had to work together if we were ever to improve things. Now, the church was very attentive to all of this. In fact, probably more attentive than any individual government. Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891 addressed the social inequity that had arisen and strengthened during the course of the Industrial Revolution. And that is basically the same thing as Pope Francis pointed out, and as I've already said, that environmental disasters do now. They increase social inequity. That's why he called the Laudato Si encyclical not a green encyclical, but a social encyclical. That was the same thing that Leo XIII had in mind in 1891. Lots of people, from Charles Dickens to Karl Marx to Pope Leo, expressed their frustration with the social inequalities being brought about by the Industrial Revolution in so many different ways, and by the huge transfer of wealth from poor to rich. Certainly Pope John the 23rd, who was Pope for just 5 years, starting in 1958, helped to move the church into the modern age, certainly taking very seriously the kind of dicta that I mentioned to you in the beginning about the need for attending to the world as it is and getting on with it, rather than simply trying to restore over and over again and in a dull and more confining way the status quo. The Second Vatican Council certainly moved us into the modern age and laid the foundation, especially for regarding peace as a moral issue and for caring for the poor as a common responsibility. And again, I would just say each of us should examine our conscience about the degree to which we personally are willing to care for the poor. How much do we need for ourselves? How much can we get for ourselves? Look at the Global Footprint Network and see how much we are getting, and then see what we can do. In a country like the United States or in Western Europe, we can make a vast difference if we really care, but we'll never make a vast difference if we operate on the myth, continue to operate on the myth that we can get richer and richer and it doesn't have any effect, or we don't care if it has any effect on anybody else. And that applies personally, nationally, in every possible way. Pope Paul VI, in his encyclical Popularum Progressio, pointed out that again, re-emphasized that again, and said it even more beautifully. And he began to emphasize the meaning of colonies and the way that rich countries were scraping the wealth out of poor countries for their own benefit. He was perhaps the first pope who laid out clearly the relationship between human progress, justice, and the environment. And he participated personally and spoke at the Stockholm Conference in 1972 that I referred to in a minute. Pope St. John Paul II, who was Pope from 1978 to 2005, was, of course, a very active environmental leader, stating on the World Day for Peace in 1990 that the world was in danger by virtue of, quote, a lack of due respect for nature, by the plundering of natural resources, and by a progressive decline in the quality of life. Benedict XVI, of course, was called the Green Pope, and he extended the discussion and consistently stressed the importance of our maintaining the productive systems of the earth for the benefit of all people and all nations. Over the past 6 years, Pope Francis has brought together these themes beautifully, and because of his gentleness, because of his embracing people, because of his understanding of people and the lives that they really lead, because of his collegiality, because of his great morality, he has inspired people all over the world, far beyond the Catholic Church. And indeed, the encyclical we're talking about is explicitly addressed to all the people of the world. At the time he was inaugurated as Pope, Pope Francis said that St. Francis of Assisi, from whom he was selecting a name, was for him, quote, the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation. And he said, these days we do not have a very good relationship with creation, do we? He said when he was inaugurated as Pope. And his wide popularity has made his words, his encyclical, especially effective and built on what is more than a half century of deep environmental concern on the part of the Catholic Church in a beautiful way. Right now, as we saw at the beginning of these remarks, Pope Francis is continuing to pursue these fundamentally important themes in the midst of so many other problems facing the Church, which actually, in the very broadest view, although very important, are very unimportant. What is really important is that we think about where we are and where we're going. Issues like how much the Church will receive, or how the Church will receive LGBT people and divorced members back into the Church, for example, which become horribly divisive and forceful issues, are really just trivial ripples in the surface of the course of history that have nothing to do with the world in which we live or the world in which we will live. It's not that they're not important issues the Church has to pay attention to, but they're nothing as important really as the big issues that I'm talking about. And Francis, in those issues, has always come down on the side of humility and inclusiveness, which is certainly why his voice, as I've said, is heard and respected around the world. He calls on all of us to exhibit humility and concern for those less fortunate in their own lives, a message that is especially pertinent to an extremely wealthy country like the United States. To do this properly, we'll have to promote international understanding, remembering the poor in our own cities as well, and to realize that the world is one. We'll have to reject the kind of tribalism that is talked about in the Tower of Babel in Genesis, and we'll have to get back to an idea where we can understand, appreciate one another. We'll have to find ways in which we can limit our own consumption and ecological footprint, in which we can continue to be educated about what's going on in the world, and in which we can demand that our leaders do much, much better than they are in dealing with reality rather than dealing with political expediency. But ultimately, even in this incredibly crowded, difficult, and challenging world, love remains the answer to all of these problems, the same as it was in the time of Jesus, and the same that it will always be. Thank you very much for your attention to these remarks.